Hey guys, today's video is a culmination of dozens of hours of testing and research that we've done over the last week or so. The results for a lot of the stuff we're going to be showing here is very weird, and some of you are going to immediately be skeptical. You're going to say things like they must have tested this wrong or they must have had a buff on without realizing it. All of that is very possible. If you guys have evidence that is going to contradict anything in this video, please just let us know. The goal here is not to get emotionally attached to one conclusion or another. The goal here is just to simply find out what the truth is. I will say that I'm not the only one working on this. There were probably about 20 other people that helped me with this, and we've been as careful as we can with our assumptions, and we've checked a lot of the data multiple times. At this point, I would say we're probably about 90 to 99% sure about all the findings in this video, but of course, there's always room for error. When we're testing this kind of stuff, we'll find one bug, and then in the process of confirming that bug, we'll find another bug, and then it kind of just spirals out of control, so things can get a little bit messy. But I will try to be as clear as I can about how certain we are, and if there's a scenario where we are less than 90% certain about something, then I'll try to point that out and say, we're speculating here or we need some more testing here. But for now, we think X, Y, and Z. We might update that in the future. So there are going to be timestamps down in the description if you want to skip around. Other than that, last thing before we jump into the results, I just want to give some acknowledgements to a few different groups of people. First of all, my guild Aftershock on the Valhalla server. Thank you guys for standing around outside of town for hours helping me figure this out. Also, another Valhalla guild, Minimus Maximus, very helpful in both the testing and the analysis of this information, so shout out to them. And then finally, the Warpath Discord, which I discovered through another YouTuber named Duke Sloth, who I recommend that you guys check out. Those guys have been extremely knowledgeable and extremely helpful, and we wouldn't have figured out a lot of this stuff without their contribution. So thank you to everyone who helped out with this, and now let's talk about the findings. So perhaps the most shocking discovery that we found through all of this is a system which scales or flattens your armor in PvP. And basically what this means is that heavy armor is still going to protect you more than medium armor, and medium armor is still going to protect you more than light armor. But a 500 gear score heavy piece does not protect you more than a 200 gear score heavy piece in PvP. And in some cases, actually, the 200 gear score piece performs significantly better than the 500 gear score piece, like way more than rounding errors. We've been trying to figure out exactly what the formula to this is, and we're not quite there yet, but we can tell you some more detail. Basically, the takeaway here is that the Phys and LM stat that you see on your character screen, this number in and of itself doesn't mean anything. There is a variety of other coefficients that are being calculated here, at least one of which is not shown or told to the player at any point, which is going to throw this off. You can have low tier heavy armor with, they're low tier heavy with like 300 armor, and it will provide way more protection than high tier light with 600 armor. So that armor number in and of itself doesn't matter, although sometimes it can be, if you raise or lower it, that can be useful, and we'll talk about that in a second. So let me show you guys a few examples of what I'm talking about here so you can get a sense for how wonky this is. So the first example here, and, we're still in the process of organizing some of this data to make it a little prettier, but you can take a look at this. This is one test we did where we were trying to see which medium loadout was the best. So kind of the theory here was that, maybe there's something that has to do with like the weight of the item divided by its gear score, or maybe the chest piece is more important than the legs, or maybe the legs are more important than the helm. So we kind of did a bunch of different medium loadout tests to see what the results were. And quite frankly, we couldn't find any pattern whatsoever. If you look at the different armor values here and the different weight values, there's sometimes when having more armor is better. There's sometimes when having more armor is worse. There's sometimes when having more weight is better. There's sometimes when having more weight is worse. So the red number here is the amount of damage you take, and the white number here is the amount of damage that you mitigate. This over here is a percentage of protection you get from the armor. And if you look at these red numbers, I mean, they just don't correlate at all. None of this makes any sense. And the most shocking thing about this is that, a lot of these values are close enough to where we could write them off as rounding errors. There's some scenarios where like the damage difference is 5 instead of 1, where that's probably not going to be due to rounding. But the weirdest outcome we got is when we swapped out the T5 boots and gloves that we were using for this test for tier 2 boots and gloves, and suddenly our mitigation skyrocketed. So, for whatever reason, these gray T2 gloves and boots were vastly outperforming the 500 something gear score tier 5 gloves and boots of the exact same weight. So these three results down here are probably the strangest one. These are all 22.2 weight loadouts, and the results are just absolutely strange. We went back and tried to recreate this later on with different stats, and unfortunately, some of the gray pieces, my buddy who was helping me test this, he didn't keep all the grays because his bank was getting full, so we couldn't get exactly the same pieces when we retested this. But funny enough, if we just did a similar test where we replaced T5 gloves and boots with gray gloves and boots, we got pretty similar results. Again, the mitigation went from like 36 point something to, last time it went to 41, this time it went to 42. So still, even though it wasn't the exact same pieces, we kind of duplicated the same results. And the mitigation values for using these low tier boots are way higher than they are from using high tier boots of the exact same weight. So we have tried to analyze this from a number of different angles, and this data sheet here represents kind of our best current guess about what's going on. So what this shows is two different sets of heavy armor. Both of these add up to 31.4 total weight. They're all heavy pieces in every slot. The set on the left has lower armor in every piece except for the chest. You can ignore the chest. For the purposes of this test, the chest piece was interchangeable. We didn't see any difference there. But all the other pieces, we did see a difference. And when we swapped out a piece from the right side for a piece on the left side, the right side pieces always performed worse than the pieces on the left, despite having higher gear score and higher armor values. So we then divided the amount of armor that the pieces had by their gear score, and we noticed something interesting. This might be a coincidence, or this might actually be the root of the problem. We haven't done enough testing yet to confirm. But on the right side, you can see here that the amount of armor per gear score is always higher on the pieces that are more effective. The one case that it's lower is on the chest, and as we already said, these numbers are too close. We don't think there's enough of a difference to detect, and that's probably why they were interchangeable. So again, we're ignoring chest, but for every single one of these other slots that were definitely worse, we see a higher ratio of armor per gear score. So our current guess is that what they did is when they were rushing to add their scaling, because if you read the patch notes during closed and open beta, they have changed the PvP scaling multiple times in response to mass feedback of people basically saying there's too much or too little. So I think they rushed to implement a final version of scaling right before launch, where in addition to taking into account your opponent's level, it also takes into account the gear score on your opponent's gear. And instead of dividing the armor by the gear score, I think they accidentally divided the gear score by the armor, so that those higher end pieces with a better ratio actually end up performing worse than those lower end pieces with a worse ratio. So the question that we get usually when we show these results is, are you sure that this isn't something that just affects duels? And the answer to that is no. I'm not 100% sure that there's not special scaling that has to do with just duels, but there are two reasons why at the moment I expect that this is going to work the same in duels that it does in open world. So the first reason is that we did all these tests in closed beta, and in closed beta we used duels for testing just as we did for this, and the armor formula in closed beta was very easy to figure out. Regardless of if you had medium or heavy or whatever else, if you had more armor, you took less damage. It was very straightforward. There wasn't any spooky hidden scaling at all. And all that was done within the context of duels. The second reason is we did do a brief test where we had an enemy faction member and we hit them in an open world scenario outside of duels. We then had them reduce their armor, so they kept their weight the same, but they put on a worse piece of gear for that slot. And the damage that they took did not change at all. So that was a very brief test. It's possible that something could be off there, and I would say that more testing should be done to confirm this 100%. But at the moment, those two things are enough for me to feel fairly confident that this, whatever scaling exists here in duels, is likely applying in open world as well. So if getting higher gear score on your armor doesn't matter, then what does? Well, first of all, getting higher gear score does matter a little bit because it helps you get higher stats and higher perks on your gear. So you'll be able to get more strength and con, etc. You'll be able to get higher rolls if you have a perk that increases your damage. The percentage of damage you get will be higher on higher gear score pieces. So there is still some benefit to having higher gear score pieces. That benefit just doesn't come in the form of offering you more protection. Some other things that matter in terms of defense is the defensive profile, for lack of a better word, on the gear. So there's a few different profiles that gear can have. The most basic one is just a 50-50 split between armor and elemental. So we can see that on the left here. I've got 83 armor, 83 physical, 83 elemental. So that's just equal 50-50 split here. Some pieces are like 60-40 split. There's a few different ratios as well. But the takeaway here is that some pieces can have a higher split of physical and some pieces can have a higher split of elemental. And if two pieces weigh exactly the same, but one of them is 50-50 and one of them has a higher physical split, you will mitigate a lot more physical damage and a lot less elemental damage on that split piece. So the absolute value of the armor doesn't work here, but the ratio of armor that the piece has is still important. If you're in a set of full heavy that's 50-50 versus a full heavy set that's Phys split and low elemental, you will notice a significant difference between those sets that intuitively matches the ratio of protection the gear has. So that seems to be mostly working as intended. Some other things that are very good for increasing your armor: the 200 Constitution perk, where you get 20% more armor. This works very well. It might even be working better than expected. It's hard to say exactly because, again, we can't quite figure out how armor is intended to work in this game due to the hidden scaling. But I can say that when you take this perk, you take way less damage from physical attacks. So if you're having problems with great axes, then this is the way to go. It'll make you way tankier. Resistance gems so far work correctly, and the reason I say so far is because we haven't gotten a chance to test every single gem at every single tier, and as we'll see later, there do seem to be certain gems that work at T2 but don't work at T3. So I can't say that every single gem in the game is working right now, but so far the resistance gems that we have tested do what they say they do. So in the case of damage absorption, if I have 10% elemental resist, then what that means is if I normally would have taken 100 damage from an elemental attack, instead I'm going to take 90. So it just multiplies the end damage that you would have taken by whatever you're resisting, and that's the end result. So resistance works very well, works multiplicatively with your armor. So definitely invest in some of those higher resist gems, although, like I said, might want to test them to make sure they do what they say they do. We'll provide an update to that later when we can. The other thing that is reducing the amount of damage that you take unintentionally right now is the Resilient perk. So Resilient is supposed to just decrease the amount of damage you take from critical hits. In reality, it reduces the damage you take from all damage sources of any kinds in PvE or PvP, and it does so before your armor is even calculated. It also reduces damage from things that are supposed to ignore your armor completely. So for example, the damage that you take from drowning gets reduced by resilient, and it matches the percentage of resilient you have. So if you have 20% resilient, you'll take 20% less damage from the 100k drowning tick that you take when you run out of breath underwater. This is such a massive bug that I probably will need to make a separate video to fully describe how many other aspects of the game this is currently breaking. But in summary, Resilient is by far the best perk that you can get on your armor in the game right now. You should make sure that you have it on every single piece. And it pretty much creates a scenario where faction gear is the best PvP armor for almost everybody. Now, there has been some discussion about faction gear versus Voidbent, since Voidbent also comes standard with the Resilient perk, and the Resilient rolls are slightly higher. So you get, I think, 4.8% Resilient from Voidbent compared to 4.5% from faction gear. So you'll get an extra 1.5% or so overall damage reduction from the Voidbent. So Personally, I just don't think that Voidbent is worth the extra money. The other perks on Voidbent aren't very good, and I think the faction gear is going to be fine for most players. But you can see here, I've made a little comparison of faction gear versus Voidbent with a few different gym setups, and you can see sort of theoretically the final amount of damage that you would be taking. This mitigation number here is just sort of made up. This is going to change depending on if you're light, medium, or heavy, and other factors. But just to serve as an example, you can see how, in most cases, the final outcome of these different setups isn't that much different. The main thing here is that Voidbent has that elemental split. So if you are specifically trying to defend against fire and ice, and you don't care so much about how much damage you're taking from, great axes and muskets and such, you can get some really crazy damage mitigation against elemental attacks with Voidbent that you can't quite get with faction gear. But of course, the opposite is true with physical. You're going to be weaker to physical if you use Voidbent. So you can take a look at this and see if it's something that you feel is worth the investment. But my advice for most of you would be just stick with the faction gear. It's way cheaper, and it's going to be as good, close to as good, and maybe even slightly better in most scenarios. Okay, so the armor scaling explanation took a little bit longer than I had hoped, but hopefully you guys are appreciating the extra detail here. I'm trying to give you every piece of the puzzle so that collectively as a community we can kind of figure this out and put it all together. Some things that we still have to cover include weapon damage, how to calculate gem scaling, the way that crowd control works, the way that healing works, bugged food buffs. We need to talk about all the bugged skill perks and armor perks that we have discovered. Still a lot of findings to go over. So I will go ahead and put a link to the next part in the description. I also stream about 5 days a week over on Twitch, so you can find me there. My name over there is Moreland TV, same as it is on this channel. All this stuff will be linked in the description. If you find the work that we're doing here valuable, please do me a favor, share the video, like, subscribe, all the algorithm stuff. All that helps me tremendously. Other than that, I'll see you guys in the next part. Peace.